when I was going through this lesson this past week and thinking about it throughout this month, there's a word that keeps coming up when it comes to the demeanor and the way in which we conduct ourselves. And these three words are some of those words. And so as we're going to look at tonight toward the end, even in our speech, we're to be kind, kindly. In our own language, it sounds a lot like the word kin. We treat one another like family in our speech. And I think that's kind of the way that we should be looking at that word. Are we kind to one another? Do we treat one another like family when we speak to one another? Are we tender-hearted? Or do our hearts ache for one another? Are we tender-hearted enough to think about how are the things I'm going to say going to affect the person that I'm speaking to? And these things, that I'm saying about somebody, if they get back to that person, how is it going to affect them? Am I tender-hearted about that? And does it hurt me deeply if I know these words may hurt them? Whether it's right or wrong for those words to hurt them, will it be something that causes me to have a hurt as well? Am I graceful in my speech? In other words, am I one who gives favor in the things that I say, or am I one that retains animosity or hatred or something else in my speech when I talk about that person? So those are some of the things we're going to talk about. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. We'll go back to James 3 in just a moment, but in Matthew 12, it's been said that, and you've probably heard this illustration before, that the typical person speaks between 10 and 20,000 words each and every day. And 10 to 20,000 words are a lot of words. Some people are on the low end of that spectrum. Some people are not. But 10 to 20,000 words is typically about the size of a small book. And most people do not read one book, even one book a year. And yet we speak that many words each day, which means really that we are speaking an entire book every day of our life. It's interesting that at the end of the world, we're all going to stand before God, and there's going to be a book that's open, and we're going to be judged according to the things that are written in that book. Jesus has this to say in Matthew chapter 12, starting at verse 33. Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or else make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for a tree is known by its fruit. Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Those verses are some verses that are extremely convicting when we think about how much that we say. If you were to consider judging and being judged, rather, by God for the things that you said just today, how does that make you feel? Are you ready to be judged by that? When I was a police officer in the military, one of the things that we often had to do was go to court. But before you went to court, you would often have a deposition. And in that deposition, they would ask you different questions about whatever case it was that was going to be brought before the court. The interesting thing about that is they record those things. And so when you go into the court, one of the lawyers may stand up and say, well, Mr. Caskey, this is what you said. And now you've got to back up what you said, verify what you said, explain what you said. For every idle word that we speak, we're going to give an account. That's why it is so very important that we as Christians be very, very purposeful. Purposeful not just in our actions before the world, not just in our actions so that God may say at the end of time, well done, good and faithful servant, but also that God may be able to say, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful even over the idle words, or those small words, those little sentences and those little conversations that you had. That is a commendable thing. Because as James says, the tongue is an unruly evil. It is full of all sorts of problems and difficulties that's attached to it. And it's almost impossible, it would seem, for man to even tame it. And yet we're going to be held accountable for how well we try to tame the tongue. And so I want us to start off by thinking about what does it mean to be this unruly evil? That means that the tongue is full of all sorts of things like deception, for example. Let's go to the book of Proverbs. You may want to place your markers in Proverbs because we're going to be in Proverbs not exclusively, but primarily for most of the lesson tonight. And we're going to look at several Proverbs. But in Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, Many times it's real easy for us to know what we should or should not do because God will provide for us lists. And notice this list that's provided for us here. Proverbs 6, starting at verse 16. These 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, notice this, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who bears lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. At least 3 of those in that list have something to do with the way in which a person speaks. But it's in association with people like those who shed blood, murderers. It's in association with those who will bring falsehood and lies against people, bear false witness against people. Not only speak something that is untrue, but be willing to raise a hand and say, yes, it is true, when it's not. God hates lying, and a deceptive tongue is an abomination, something that makes God sick. When you think about what kind of tree we are, that's not the fruit that should be coming off of it. And also in Luke 23, I think it bears looking at, there's several different ways in which a person can lie or deceive. Luke 23 and verse 2. This is what was said about Jesus. And there's 3 different ways that deception is represented here. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation. That's vague. That's one way we can deceive people, is by saying things that are kind of vague. I have noticed that over the years I have grown extremely frustrated, I guess is a good word for it, with vague speech. That people will say certain things and they want to veil what it is that they're really meaning by it. And so they may throw up this huge smoke screen about something that sounds outrageous, but they're not giving any specifics about what they exactly mean. This fellow is perverting the nation. Well, what does that mean? How do you mean he's perverting the nation? What is he doing? Secondly, he says, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Another way in which people lie is just by flat out lying, telling something that is completely untrue. Jesus never said it was wrong to pay taxes to Caesar. On the contrary, Jesus on at least 2 occasions showed that you should be paying your taxes. The third way is this, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Another way that sometimes people will lie and deceive is by misapplication. Did Jesus say this thing? Yes. Was it misrepresented? Yes. That's another way that sometimes we will deceive people, or people will tell lies about one another, is they'll take a phrase or something that a person said and they will use it completely out of context and will twist it around to mean something that it never meant. So we have to be careful that when we're speaking to other people that we're not being deceptive in that speech. Also in Proverbs 12 in verses 17 through 22. Proverbs 12 in verse 17. He who speaks truth declares righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is one who speaks like the piercing of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. The truthful lip shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but counselors of peace have joy. No grave trouble will overtake the righteous, but the wicked shall be filled with evil. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. I think it's somewhere between 200 and 300 times in the book of Proverbs alone, the idea of speech is addressed. So obviously it's something that we're supposed to be extremely wise in. But one of the things that's mentioned in the host of all these verses that talk about lying and deception is this, is that lying lips, deception, is but for a moment. The thing about lies is that when we speak them, at the moment it may make us feel like we've been delivered from a situation. That I've given an excuse for something that I know is not true, but at least it got the heat off of me for a moment. Or I was able to excuse myself from the actions that I did without making myself look bad. And for that moment, it may make us feel really, really good that we've won some type of a victory. Or we may lie about another person, and when we've said that thing, it really made us feel good because now we've hurt that person, we've defamed their character, and we've said something that's going to cause others to look down upon them. And it may make us feel like we've won for the moment. But the bad thing about lies, among many things that are bad about it, is that you can never run away from a lie. You always have to tell another one, and another one, and another one until eventually you have to come clean. They chase you down. And so that victory that you feel is but for a moment. In John 8, verse 44, Jesus, in talking with the religious leaders of the time, speaks to them about being like their Father. And I think this is why the Bible talks so much about the way in which we speak and about how lying is so detrimental and antithesis to who we're supposed to be as Christians. Is because in John 8, he says, you're like your father, the devil. He was a murderer. He was a liar. And he was that way from the beginning. When the devil speaks, he speaks from his own resources, which literally means he speaks his native language. And so whenever we're speaking a lie, it's like we were born into the house of Satan. That's the language we grew up with. But when we become Christians and when we are in the household of God, that's not the kind of language we were taught. That's not the tongue that we learned. And so we ought to be people who are always speaking the truth as our native language. The tongue is also destructive and an unruly evil because it is divisive. We saw that from Proverbs 6 a moment ago. He who spreads discord among brethren is also one that the Lord finds sickening in his presence. In Proverbs 18 and verse 8, the words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. One of the ways in which this division occurs with the tongue is going to someone and say, did you hear what so-and-so said? Did you hear what so-and-so did? Did you know that? And to the one who is saying it and to the one who is listening, many times it is like a tasty trifle. No, I didn't. What did they say? What did they do? I didn't hear about that. No, tell me. And it's a real danger when we get into the areas of slander and gossip. Gossip is one of those things that when we participate in gossip, it's usually done in secret, that we may have a conversation with someone and it may go like this. I'm going to tell you something about this person, but you got to promise me you don't tell someone else. Slander is more speaking out about the person in order that you might tear their character down unjustly. And so you may proclaim to others, no, that person is this or this person did that. But the purpose is not because it is the truth that we need to be aware of or cautious of as much as it is we're trying to destroy the person. And so again, the tongue is an unruly evil in that it doesn't practice things correctly. We also have in Proverbs 20 in verse 19 that he who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with the one who flatters with their lips. We're also told in Proverbs 16, verses 27 and 28, an ungodly man digs up evil, and it is on his lips like a burning fire. A perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. Those verses are real interesting to me, and admittedly, I had sort of forgot about those being in connection together until I was studying for this. He goes around digging for something. And that's something I have seen among people in general, but when it happens among brethren, it's distasteful. That we're always going around trying to dig something up on somebody. Always going around trying to find something new that we can find out about a person or a group of people. That we're not satisfied to deal with our own business, but we also have to be involved in the business of everybody else. And then when we find that thing, it's like a burning fire on my lips. I've got to get rid of this. I've got to get this off my chest, is our phrase that we use. I've got to tell somebody about this. And when we do that, we end up separating the best of friends when that happens. That's a dangerous combination, and it's one that we have to be careful of. That's why in the New Testament it tells that the younger widows are actually supposed to remarry so that they don't go around as being busybodies in other people's affairs. In Proverbs 17, verse 9, it says that he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. It's real easy for us to gossip about others and say things about others that they have done. And because of that, it can be divisive among brethren. The tongue can also be hasty. In Proverbs 18 and verse 17, the first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. There's been a lot of times where I was talking about something that I thought I was very correct about that, because most of the time I am. But somebody else comes along and says, no, actually that's not right. For a long time, I thought that when the subject of alcohol and drinking came up, I would often think, well, no, that wouldn't be right. Jesus didn't drink, and John the Baptist wouldn't drink because of the Nazarite thing, because he was from Nazareth. No, they're not even closely associated with each other. But that was one of those things that because they sounded alike, and when I was very early on in my faith, that's one of the things that sounded plausible, so I went with it. No, that wasn't right. And it's real easy for us to think that we're correct about something and share it with someone else and be very, very hasty about that thing without first finding out the facts. And that happens too often, that we jump to a conclusion about something. We draw a conclusion. We state a case. We take a stand. We will be adamant about something before we've actually taken into account all the information that we possibly can. That's why we need to be very, very careful about how we use our tongues. It's also why we have to be very, very careful about social media. Because back in the day, people used to have to, if they wanted to write a letter to someone, you actually had to take out a piece of paper and a pen. And you had to write it down. And then probably scratch that and rewrite it again. And before you sent it, you would have to read it again. And then you'd probably have to fold it and find an envelope and put it in the envelope and lick the envelope and put a stamp on the envelope and then find a mailbox to put it in. And after all that process, along the way, sometimes people said, you know what? I think I've made too big a deal out of this. And the letter never gets sent. But not today. Today, you can instant Twitter feed it, whatever it is, and it's gone. And as soon as you put it out there in the open, in front of everybody, everybody reads it. And it was what was on your mind at that time. And you may sound right when you first say something until somebody else comes along and corrects you in that matter. Be careful about your tongue being hasty in the things that you say. Proverbs chapter 25, verses 8 through 10. Do not go hastily to court, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor has put you to shame? Debate your case with your neighbor, and do not disclose the secret to another, lest he who hears it expose your shame, and your reputation be ruined. Throughout the Scriptures, even in the Old Testament, it says that when you have something against your brother, fix that with your brother. Don't share it with other people. Certainly don't take it to court. Don't do those things hastily. Make sure you, to the best of your ability, settle this the way it's supposed to be settled. In the New Testament, it tells you, go to your brother. If he doesn't hear you, take a few more witnesses. If he doesn't hear that, take it to the church. 1 Corinthians 6 tells us to handle things amongst ourselves as brethren. Don't be hasty about things. We all feel we're justified in whatever position that we have. But oftentimes, we're going to be put to shame. There was a preacher that I knew several years ago that was helping out another preacher in a debate that he was having. And when he was having this debate, he very much won the argument that was taking place. And that's what the other preacher told him. He said, you won the argument, but you lost the debate. In other words, you won the point because you made your point, but you made it so poorly, and you didn't exercise good discretion in your speech that no one wanted to listen to you. That's the point. You show yourself to be petty when those types of things happen. So we need to be very, very careful about being too hasty with our speech. Sometimes we just speak way too much as well. Proverbs 17, 27 and 28. It says that he who spares knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of a calm spirit. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he's considered perceptive. Those are some brilliant passages that the Lord gave to us to teach us to listen and to be the kind of people who listen. I do want to say something as we're talking about the idea of unruly evil, about the subject of euphemisms. We actually had a lesson, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, on euphemisms. But what a euphemism is a substitution of a mild, indirect, or it's a substitution of a mild, indirect, or vague expression for one thought to be offensively hard, harsh, or blunt. In other words, it's a good way of saying something that most of the time people don't want to hear, or it could be offensive to them. So in one way, euphemisms are a really good thing that we have. And you actually find a lot of euphemisms in the Scriptures. I just want to share with you two. In Acts 17, verse 60, or Acts 7 rather, verse 60, you have Stephen who is preaching. And the Jews become angry at him, and they rush at him, gnashing at him with their teeth, and they stone Stephen to death. Now, Stephen was murdered. Stephen was killed, okay? but the scriptures say that he fell asleep. That's a euphemism. It's a less offensive way, and it's a way of making beautiful, commendable, make something that is an awful thing sound good. And that's what euphemisms do. But also in the Old Testament, and this one is very blunt, 1 Samuel chapter 24. And as I was looking these up, there are a lot of them, especially in the Old Testament, that are very, very blunt and offensive sounding, but they're put in a really good way so that we can understand what's being talked about without being offended by the language. But it says that this is in the New King James. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. Now the ESV says that he went in basically to relieve himself. The Old King James says to cover his feet. Now that's an expression I would not have known what that meant. But these words are used for us to describe something that we know what's being talked about, but it's not something that's polite in certain company. And so you want to soften that language. I even hear adults sometimes saying, I'm going to potty. You know they've got kids. Because your kids are going to repeat the language they hear you saying. And so if you use some language that's not in and of itself wrong or evil or sinful, however, it can be offensive. And so you use different language in order to soften that, but it still communicates the right idea. That being said, sometimes euphemisms are used because the expression is vulgar or profane or ugly. And so we try to be just as profane and ugly as the word without using the exact word. That's when euphemisms cross a line. And that's when it is that we ought not be using them. And so it is not to be used to profane things that are holy. Hebrews 12, verses 28 and 29. Hebrews 12, verses 28 and 29. It says, Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire. Our God is a consuming fire. We serve him with reverence and godly fear. We don't do that acceptably when we go around using the phrase, the OMG phrase. We don't do that. Sometimes, though, we soften that by instead of using God's name, we may say, oh my goodness, oh my gracious, oh my good gracious. And we may say things like that. And it's not that that phrase in and of itself, by itself, is what's offensive, but what is behind it is. We also need to understand that generationally speaking, that sometimes these words have different meanings. It may be that in this generation, oh my goodness may not sound like such a horrible phrase, but to other generations, earlier generations, it definitely does, because we know exactly what that sounds like to us. You have to be aware. The point is this, is that as Christians, we're not supposed to be giving offense. As much as we possibly can, we're not supposed to be giving offense. Paul said that he wanted to always conduct himself commendably so that his ministry is not hindered by who he is. You can do a lot of damage to your influence as a Christian by not being careful about your use of certain phrases. We don't have to have a list of all the ones that are acceptable and all the ones that are not. You can usually tell by the company that's around you. You can also usually tell by those who say to you, let's not say that anymore. My grandmother one time popped me on the lip when I was a child because I said, hot dog, because to her, that was a curse because it sounded like certain curse phrases that were used in her generation. And I learned, you don't say that. Very quickly, words and phrases change. And culturally, words and phrases are different. And you have to be very, very careful about your speech. Euphemisms are great in that they can allow us to say things that need to be said, but we can say them in a soft way. But they're also very dangerous things because our tongue is an unruly evil, and we may use them in a way that's inappropriate. And so we need to not be giving offense. In Matthew 23, Jesus gives an example of the way in which this can happen as well. Matthew 23 and verse 22. He who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Sometimes we may say things like, well, I swear, I promise. We may elicit the name of God in doing those things. We're not to. We're not supposed to take what is holy and profane it. The first 3 of the commandments are all about how God is to be honored and glorified and magnified, and that we are not to use his name in vain. The point is this. We started at the very beginning, and Jesus said that we're going to be held accountable for every idle word that we speak, which means the things that come out of your mouth are things that you allowed to come out of your mouth. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit. The reason that phrase comes out of my mouth is because my heart is not what it's supposed to be. That if my heart was where it was supposed to be, and if I was thinking more about my lips and the things I said, then I would refrain my tongue from certain phrases or from even speaking at all. But God says you're going to be held accountable for what you say. And that's a scary thing, especially when you think about use of some of these other terms. Another way that euphemisms are used that is not good is when we try to use them to make an excuse for what it is that is actually in our heart. Revelation 21, verse 8. It talks about those who will not be entering into life eternal, but go into the second death. But the cowardly, there's no euphemism involved there. The unbelieving, that's not a euphemism. Abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, all liars. Those are not euphemisms. But sometimes we use euphemisms in order to excuse that. For the cowardly, we say, well, I was concerned or I was worried. When really the expression is cowardly. And you can go through that list and you can attach euphemisms to all those phrases that may excuse certain behavior. Sometimes, well, that's just the way that I am. Well, that's how he is, to excuse bad behavior. We're not supposed to do that. The Bible is explicit, and we're not to use euphemisms to cover it up. I'll do it in Matthew 18, verses 6 through 9. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. So you think about the person that causes others to be offended. And we say, well, that's just how he is. Well, that's just old brother so-and-so. Jesus said it'd be better if brother so-and-so were to have a millstone put around his neck and thrown to the depth of the sea. That's how serious it is. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to the man by whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. Brother so-and-so would be better off if he would learn to behave better and speak better. That's what Jesus says. So again, we can use euphemisms to cover things up, but we shouldn't. Colossians 4 and verse 6. Here the Apostle Paul says that we are to let our speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. As Christians, we have a responsibility to learn. And one of the things that we're supposed to learn is this: how to answer other people. That I can't just shoot from the hip, or in this case, shoot from the lip. I'm not to just say things that first thing that comes to my mind. I'm not to be bombastic. I'm to be tender-hearted, kind, gracious, and learn how to answer people. It takes a lot of work, and it's also something that comes with a lot of mistakes being made along the way. So as we've talked about with a lot of these types of lessons, give yourself time. Give yourself some benefit of the doubt that, yes, I am going to improve in this area. It's just going to take some effort and some doing. But it's a skill that we can all develop. And we shouldn't excuse it with just saying, well, that's how I am. That's how I was raised. That's what I've always seen and heard. That's not an excuse. So let's talk for just a moment about, so what is commendable speech? There's one passage of Scripture I want us to look at in Ephesians chapter 4. And this is a really good section of Scripture when it comes to addressing our speech. But I want you to think about just Ephesians in general. The first 2 chapters of Ephesians talks about the great wonder and glory that's been revealed to us, that God pre-selected a certain type of people to be saved, predestined them to be saved. And that it's a great blessing, it's a grace that's been shown to us that we were able to hear this gospel, to respond to it, and to be conformed to those kinds of people that God was looking for to adopt. In Ephesians 2 and verse 10, we were created in Christ Jesus for good works. And it's not just the outward appearance that has changed, but the inward man has what's been changed. And so chapter 3 and 4 has a lot to do with the kind of character we're supposed to have now. And so he tells us in chapter 4 especially several times about the things that we say and the old man and how he's been put away. But in chapter 4 he starts talking about this unity that we're supposed to have. In chapter 4 and starting at verse 1, he's going to talk about 6 different keys that bring about unity. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you are called. Here's the first key, with all lowliness. Secondly, gentleness. Third, long-suffering. Fourth, bearing with one another. Fifth, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. In other words, there's one truth. Those are the 6 keys to maintaining unity. And so when we start talking about how it is that we are to be talking, the speech that we're supposed to have, the kind of speech that does not divide brethren, but the kind of speech that unites brethren, this is the kinds of things that we're supposed to be talking about. We're supposed to be talking about humility and speaking humbly. We're supposed to be talking about love and be loving in our speech. And it should be reflected in the way in which we behave with one another. He continues in this chapter by talking about those who have these spiritual gifts, like the preachers and the teachers and all these who are going to carry forth the word. But he says in verse 15 that with all these spiritual gifts, one thing that they're supposed to do, even though they have spiritual gifts, they are to be speaking the truth in love, that we may grow up into all things to him who is the head, namely Christ. We have been taught, as it says in verse 20, we have not so learned Christ as being people, as it talks about earlier, who are beyond and past feeling. But he says in verse 25, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor. Why? Because we are members. We have unity with each other. Speak the truth with one another. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Don't give place to the devil. A person who used to steal, don't steal any longer, but rather work with your hands so that you can give to someone else who has need. And then at the end of Ephesians 4, he says these words, let no corrupt word. I think some of your versions say unwholesome words. What that term literally means is twisted. Don't let anything perverse, anything that is twisted. It's not talking about vulgarity. It's talking about something that is twisted. It is outside the norm. Don't let that proceed from your lips. You are a Christian. Don't speak in a way that Christians shouldn't speak. And we all know what that sounds like. Whether we hear it from someone else or we hear it from ourselves, we know what it sounds like. So don't let it come out of your own mouth. Don't let corrupt words come out of your mouth. Instead, what is good for necessary edification, building up of one another, that it might impart grace to the hearers. Don't grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as Christ forgave you. And in all these things, we can see the importance of the tongue. Don't be angry. Well, how do you know when someone's angry? It may be the use of the tongue, because your wife won't speak to you. And so she is choosing to not speak when there should be some speech going on. And when there is speech going on, be kind, be tender-hearted, be forgiving, and let one another know what's going on in the way that is right. And brethren, especially amongst ourselves, it's real easy to cause problems among brethren by misuse of the tongue. It sets the world on fire. And the tongue itself is set on fire by hell. That's how powerful it is. Every beast has been tamed, the scriptures say. But who can tame the tongue? It's such a little member. It's like the rudder of a ship that this little rudder is able to turn this huge ship. You can completely destroy your reputation. You can completely destroy a congregation. You can completely destroy your family. You can completely destroy your job by just simply misspeaking and not being careful about the use of the tongue. So as we said at the beginning, Jesus said that we're going to be held accountable. And so the question I want to leave you with is are you ready to be judged by what you say? When I think of that, it is very convicting, because I know that there's been many times where I've said things that should not have been said, or said things that should have been said, but didn't say them in the right way. And for those things, I need God's mercy. And there may be someone else in this audience tonight who also needs that mercy, who's ready to confess their sins and say to God that I want to be more dedicated to you, not just in the things that I do, but also the things that I say, and then that you need God's help in that. If we can help you in any way tonight, if you're subject to the invitation, we're here to help. Please let us know as together we stand and sing.